our numbers were low didn't mean that things weren't going to happen. So they should have kept everything closed. You know, it's a pandemic, it's an airborne virus, you know, and it's spreading and because of it.
Yeah, I was concerned about that.
Okay, I think we're back in business. Apologies. So yeah, start over. Thank you.
We just got some messages. Thank you, Miriam, for sending messages that it's working. Thank you all so much for your patience with that. We know that technology has its own mind sometimes, so thank you so much for your patience with that, as well as notifying us the audio wasn't working. So we're going to start all over, and we're so glad that you've joined us here on the second Saturday of the month. My name is Monica. There is a little bit of an echo. But my name is Monica, and I'm with the All African People's Revolutionary Party, and here is my comrade here with us. You want to introduce yourself?
Hi, my name is Gabrielle, and I'm with the All African People's Revolutionary Party.
Yes, and before we start any of our shows, any of our segments, we really want to do a land acknowledgement because that is dear to us to do that. And Gabby, I'm going to pass that to you to do.
Thank you. So we live on Tewa territory, and that is what we know as New Mexico. Consists of 23 Indian tribes and 19 Pueblos, 3 Apache tribes, and the Navajo Nation.
And we definitely want to acknowledge, thank you, Gabby, that this is Indigenous land. We organize in solidarity with our Indigenous relatives to have their land back, as well as we fight for our land back in Africa, and we say that as true-heartedly to fight for land back. Onya Sawu has said in the past, it doesn't matter how long something was stolen, you still have to give it back, and we fully support that. The All African People's Revolutionary Party, we are a revolutionary organization with a Pan-Africanism focus with our political objective of having one unified socialist Africa. So we are about liberating our people here in Africa and all across the diaspora. Every second Saturday of the month, we do a film series, and we're so excited today because we are showing 2 films, and they're going to have a discussion afterwards. So the first film, Gabby, would you like to talk about what the first film is going to be about?
Yes. So the first film is called What's in a Name, and that has a panel which includes Kwame Ture and the others discussing how they self-identify in the society using the terms African, Black, or African American.
And the second one is an interview. It's with DemocracyNow, who's interviewing Nick Estes, who is a comrade in the Red Nation, an organizer, and a leader in Native liberation. And it is on Nick's book that talks about our history in the future, Standing Rock versus the Dakota Access Pipeline, and long tradition of indigenous resistance. So what we're going to do is we're going to watch both films, and then we're going to have group discussions on each film. And we're going to tune in right now to What's in a Name.
With our struggle since the 60s, you will see nothing but betrayals by the petty bourgeois elements in our society. The African bourgeoisie is the most corrupt bourgeoisie in the world. In Africa, they seek luxury in the midst of mass suffering. There are more Mercedes in Africa than in any other continent in the world. In America, as soon as they arrive at a position based on this blood of the people, they snatch that position and run away from the people. But you must not think that they represent the people. They only represent their opportunistic self, using the people every step of the way. So you must not be confused. It must be clear then, for the 60s, the class struggle in the African Revolution must be more ruthless and uncompromising than in any other revolution. Here then the masses must come without pity and without mercy to trample upon these reactionary pigs who, after the people have gained struggle through their blood, come to hand back the gains on a silver platter to the very enemy the people fought. This will come as a natural consequence. The people themselves are everywhere screaming that it's time for them to deal with these reactionary pigs. Even in America, they say, our leaders must be held accountable. They're only saying here that these people must be accountable to those who made it possible for them to get there. Thus, not only is the revolution inevitable, but it is clarifying itself and it is qualifying itself. For the African masses everywhere, the clairpoised position now for class struggle has become inevitable and irreversible. The petty bourgeoisie everywhere will be running for cover, but the masses will spare them not. Consequently, we who have dedicated our lives to the people's struggle, we who, knowing that the people will always be free, we, understanding that we must make a contribution to qualify our struggle since the 60s, have been dedicating all our energies to only one task: the organization of the masses of our people. The organization of the masses of our people. We are not running for mayor, we're not running for president. No changes can come from the top down. We're not stupid. Changes can only come from the bottom up. The masses and the masses alone can make them. If you want to learn something from the 60s, the lesson is simple: organize the masses of the people. Thank you.
Next tonight, we look at one of the most vigorous internal debates in the black community in the past 2 decades. It's the issue of changing from black to African American. It had only been 22 years since the last major name change had occurred. It happened just after a white racist shot James Meredith, the first black graduate of Ole Miss. The shooting occurred on a southern highway as Meredith was leading a voter registration march from Memphis, Tennessee to Jackson, Mississippi. It so enraged student activist Stokely Carmichael that as he emerged from a Greenwood, Mississippi jail where he had been held for his voter registration work, the first words to emerge from his mouth were "Black Power." It was the beginning of a major new phase in black confidence and self-assertion that captured the imagination and stirred the consciousness of black people all over the world. Now, according to some polls, a majority of black people have said they prefer the term African American. But the issue is far from settled.
I prefer to be called African American because African American reflects the true nature of my cultural heritage.
And I think it's better for you to be called black. What's wrong with that? It's different black. It's black Africans. It's black West Indians, you know. Black is beautiful. That's what I have to say.
I'm an American, whether I'm a black American or what, don't make any difference. I'm just an American.
You had the caucus in the election, they kept calling him Greek American, so being that every black person over here has African heritage, you know, it should be called African American.
Editorials in both black and white publications generally supported the call to use African American. The New York Times called it healthy archaeology, arguing that blacks may now feel comfortable enough in their standing as citizens to adopt the family surname American, and their first name, African, conveys a pride in cultural heritage that all Americans cherish. Said the Chicago Defender, as the world continues to shrink, Americans who speak to their Africanness with the African American title will likely find the cultural, education, and economic relationship with others much smoother. Opinion also varied among the guests we interviewed in our special Black History Month series.
I always thought that Afro-American or African-American was the appropriate designation. And there is some beneficial effects in acknowledging the reality, the African heritage and the American presence. But that's not the critical issue. The critical issue is gaining power.
I believe that it is important for us as a people to think that we are connected to the world, because the African diaspora was for real. We were sent to different parts of the world.
Well, naturally, it's our heritage. But all of us here are really educated and exposed to American life. So is that we really are, we have to dig back for this ancestry. I mean, I'm not an African.
It's a very complicated question. So rather than argue over it, let's not give up black, let's not give up Africa. So in all the work that I do, the essays I write, I use both interchangeably.
For more on the story, we turn now to 4 other people with different views. Kwame Ture is an organizer with the All African People's Revolutionary Party, a group attempting to politically unite African people living in 113 countries all over the world. It was his call for black power in 1966, when he was known as Stokely Carmichael, that catapulted the term black into popular usage. Leon Winter is a copy editor for the Wall Street Journal, and last week wrote an article that appeared on the journal's op-ed page called "This African American Still Feels Black." J. Bruce Llewellyn is a businessman who owns the 8th largest Coca-Cola bottling company in the country. He also owns television station WKBW, an ABC affiliate in Buffalo. Ramona Edlin is president of the National Urban Coalition. She proposed the name change at the Chicago meeting of black leaders last December. And to you, Ms. Edlin, the current initiative is largely your brainchild. Why is it important to use that term and not black?
Charlene, we have an opportunity to renew values such as mastery and learning, the importance of the family, unity, which is of the utmost importance right now, at a time when our children couldn't be in more distress and turmoil, when we face a new century, and it's up to us to be sure that the problem of the 21st century is not also the problem of the color line, as Du Bois prophesied in 1903 this century would be.
But how does how does African American affect all of that?
Well, we see, going back to African cultural ties, to the land base that is our mother, as crucial in this process. And what I'm hoping is that we can recreate some of the spirit of the movement years, particularly for the children, by going back to values which were stripped systematically from us, as we all know, when we were enslaved for 250 years in this nation.
Mr. Winter, you don't want to change from black.
No, well, I don't disagree that it is important for us to be cognizant of where we come from and the depth of our history that began before slavery. I just don't see the particular need in calling for renewal of the movement to leapfrog over the 400-odd years of history and of proud accomplishments that we can point to and indeed need to reacquaint our children with here in this country first. So I believe that it is important to teach the children and to, in general, imbue Black America with the knowledge of where it comes from, but to focus this effort on claiming what is ours here as Americans, which is the country that we are citizens of and where we pay our taxes.
Mr. Llewellyn, you prefer the term American.
Well, I guess in all my years on this earth, I've been called about 5 or 6 different things. I've been called black, I've been called Afro-American, now we're talking about African-American, I've been called Negro, I've been called colored. And what strikes me as a continuous theme or theorem in all of this is the fact that we never have been called full citizens of the United States of America. And what I'd like to see accomplished once and for all is that we are considered as full citizens and have all the rights and privileges there too. All I see is that people in Russia, people in Poland, people in Nicaragua are all packing their bags and heading for the United States of America, feeling it's some kind of panacea or a great place to be, and there must be something here that brings all these people. All I'm saying to you is that I think it's a disgrace that we have been here for well over 200 years and we have not enjoyed these full benefits that a lot of people have come here generation after generation and gotten. And I think that's the key, that's where we ought to go. I'll be very honest with you, if I had my druthers, I wouldn't be worrying so much about whether you call me African American or not. I would like very much to see throughout this country, as other groups have put in museums called Holocaust, to see slavery museums. Museums which would show are suffering our contribution over the years up until the year 1989 as to what we have done to give something to America. I think to try and leapfrog back and take youngsters in 1989 and tell them about our agrarian background in Africa is almost impossible at this point in time. The other problem with this is I listened to one gentleman on the thing say, well, during the campaign we talked about Michael Dukakis as being a Greek American. Well, Greek American pinpoints a country called Greece. African American does not pinpoint any country. It is a continent. And therefore, either you're going to play a game called European American or African American, or otherwise, again, we still haven't been able to refine ourselves down to where we come from, whether we come from Nigeria or Kenya.
All right. Well, let me just go to Mr. Ture here. In the 1960s, as I said before, you were one of the ardent proponents of using the term black. How do you feel now about abandoning it in favor of African American?
Well, I do not even use the term African American. I use the term Africans because that's what we are. We're Africans in America. There's nothing American about us. Our history has only been a history of struggle in America. We are the only ethnic group in America who have to shed our blood to make reform. To get the vote, we must shed our blood. To get our children to school, we must shed our blood. To get on a bus and sit where we want, we must shed our blood. To even get in a filthy 5 and 10 cent store, we must shed our blood. So I don't see how we could be American. We're Africans in America struggling against American capitalism. And only until it's destroyed will we enjoy the rights that everyone else is speaking of.
Well, how do you respond to that, Mr. Llewellyn?
Well, what he's trying to do is to change the name of the game or change the rules. And I haven't got time to change the rules. I've got to look at what is. I guess I'm more practical about this. Maybe the ideal panacea is to change the rules and make it all a kind of a equal socialistic state. But in the meantime, let's talk about what is. This is a capitalistic society. We are here. We are paying our taxes. We are doing work each and every day. And I think we have the right to participate. We have sent people to war since the revolutionary times and spilled our blood for America, from Crispus Attucks and the Revolutionary War all the way down through this Vietnam. So therefore, I want to get what you can construe as my piece of the action like everybody else has gotten. And it really annoys me to see people who haven't made this kind of contribution over the years come here and feel that they can claim it and get it. And we have done that.
You have a response to that?
Of course. In the first place, just because we're in just because we're in the capitalist system doesn't mean we must love it. We were made slaves. It doesn't mean that while you're a slave, you must love slavery. A conscious slave, while picking cotton on the plantation, is thinking about how to escape, how to bring freedom. Therefore, just because we're in capitalism doesn't mean we must enjoy it. We have to fight for an equal society. That's our history. Our people show that we spill blood instinctively to advance humanity. And we have this responsibility to advance America, yes, to a socialist state.
You would seem to imply from your comment that capitalism is utterly inconsistent with Africa and Africans.
It is.
But I would posit that that's not true. If you look again at the nations of Africa, if you look at African people in every country of the world, especially in recent times, they essentially want things. They want products. They want the things that it's, at least up to this point, demonstrated that only capitalism, with its imperfections and with its inequities, which hopefully some people believe can still be tamed, people want things. And I don't somehow see a worldwide Pan-Africanism as also spelling the death knell for capitalism at the same time. It seems inconsistent. There are too many people who want cars in Lagos, Nigeria, last time I checked. The traffic jams are horrendous.
I don't think we can solve that one right now, but let me just go back to Ramona Edelin, because both Mr. Winter and Mr. Llewellyn talked about how they don't think it's possible to leapfrog over a lot of history and go back. It's impossible to go back to the agrarian life, that you can't even pinpoint a place in Africa where black people come from, if I'm paraphrasing your comments correctly. How do you respond to that?
Well, first of all, our culture and heritage in Africa entail far more than agrarian economies. Mathematics and science were born in Africa, philosophy and religion, and as well as that, we've been accomplished musicians and dancers for centuries. There's so much in our cultural heritage that we need to recoup right now, particularly for the children. And it is possible to leapfrog, as they put it. As a matter of fact, it's not only possible, it's necessary, because if you begin with slavery, then you will still have children looking in your eyes as they do in mine, in our cities and in the streets, and saying, what difference does it really make to you, to me, or to anyone else, whether I live or die, whether I take drugs, whether I kill another person, whether I learn anything in school? We have a responsibility. And I think that one way we can have a cultural renaissance is to identify with a land base that gave us the wonderful things about our nature and our culture.
Mr. Llewellyn?
Well, that all sounds very nice and wonderful, but I invite you to take a look at Africa right now and today and look at the situation in Eritrea against Ethiopia and all the other things that have happened, Biafra with the Nigerians and what have you. That, in my opinion, is idealistic and not the gut of the problem. The gut of the problem is something called values. The gut of the problem is something called family. The gut of the problem is something called importance. What do we construe and believe to be important?
I would submit that without a cultural offensive, without our unifying at this particular time and saying what we believe in and who we are and how we will train our children and what our families mean to us, that we will continue to have those same gut issues. That's precisely the point. We will continue unless we develop a cultural vehicle which will move us forward. All groups move forward by strength of their culture. It is a myth that individuals move forward. And certainly we cannot accept 2 or 3 of our group emerging year after year while the vast masses of us continue to go down. We have a responsibility.
Let me raise a point back to you, Kwame Ture. When you launched this move that resulted in black being adopted as the defining symbol for African American people, many people felt that it helped to purge them of all the negative feelings about themselves, that it really represented the first major psychological break. And you heard the woman in the tape talk about black is beautiful. I mean, that was the most positive affirmation of blackness by black people. What do you say to people now who say you simply cannot abandon the term that came to symbolize so much for black people?
Human progress does not stand still. It moves. We came here as Africans. One of the first organizations we had fighting for us is known as the Free African Society. The very first independent organization we had in this country was the church. It was known as the African Methodist Episcopalian Church. So from Africans, our oppressor has changed us to colored, to Negro, to this, to that. We understand it's a step. Coming to black had a powerful point, because the point was that we were oppressed because of this color of our skin, and this was racism. But this fight is not just a fight over the color of our skin. A fight for power is a fight for land. When Mr. Llewellyn speaks about power, he's talking about land. Our land is Africa. America is not our land. It belongs to the American Indians, and we have a right to stand and take a moral struggle with them. And we don't worry about people being for things. People want things is incorrect. The point is not to explain the world. The point is to change it. If the people want material things, then we have a responsibility to tell them that things more important than material things, like freedom.
Mr. Winter?
Well, I can't claim to have been there, indeed, when black was coined, because I was somewhat in high school, and I was on the listening end as, indeed, you were doing the talking. But it's always been my feeling that black was more than the recognition of where our blood comes from. It has a lot to do with the experience of people of color in a larger sense under colonialism, whether it was external colonialism, let's say in the Caribbean, or the internal colonialism that we had to deal with here in the United States, rather than simply a statement of Africa. Because the fact is, we have become more than simply descendants of Africa. We have created a lot of what America is in our own image. When you talk about this cultural-based offensive, I would rather see us claim American culture, which is not European culture. America does not mean white. American doesn't mean white. It means a combination of European and African and Asian and the rest of the cultures of the whole world. This is what America is. And if it denies the fact of what is African within it, then it's up to us to continue to assert that no, America does not mean white. America means a melting and a combination of things.
I think that's the point. We are saying African and American, and Not everyone is willing to say American, and not everyone is willing to say African, but the point is we are trying to merge the two, and American society at this point in time does exclude the African reality. America is an African as well as a European invention. Well, we know that, but it isn't accepted widely as now.
Let me ask you this, Ms. Eland. What is wrong? Hakeem Madabuti said a few moments ago that in his writing and everything, he's going to use both. I mean, is there a problem with using African American for those who choose to, and for those who choose to use black? No, I think we all will use both to a certain extent. First of all, it's going to be hard to break old habits that were very dear to us, and I certainly was along with Stokely in the days when the name was changed. But it is important to continue to draw the consciousness of our people to a set of values which were positive and productive for us. To call our mother's name is Africa. We are children without her if we leave that out, and I think that it's fair to say no one of us is satisfied with the status quo today. Well, it seems that Time magazine, in fact, has a piece on this week, and it says that for more than a century, descendants of freedmen have debated what name they should bear as a people, and in every instance, the shift in the change of appellation coincided with a new phase in the struggle for equality. Is that what's going on now, in your view, and what stage is this?
Yes, and I think this is a point of evolution in our culture, and it's the stage right before we cross the threshold to the 21st century. I think we are saying that there's a quickening of our will. We will not cross the threshold of the 21st century in the condition that we are today.
All right, let me ask Mr. Winter, what do you think about that?
I don't necessarily see this as a quickening, if you will, in that kind of direction. It seems to me that a move like this is an attempt more at a rhetorical assertion to sort of put a new name on things. But I don't see where it quite takes us to getting a better handle on what is immediately in front of us.
Maybe I should say, Charlene, that the cultural offensive is going to entail agenda setting, goal setting, working together to achieve our purposes. As you well know, Charlene, in the movement years, when you decided to desegregate the University of Georgia along with Ham, we were unified around your decision. We were purposeful. We were powerful. There was a sense of destiny, and we achieved our goals. What we are so sadly lacking now is any sense of purpose or destiny. We are not setting agendas. We are not working together, though we're working very hard.
But is that because we don't have the right name?
Well, the name change is the first step in what we hope will be a self-conscious examination of our culture, going back to our ancient as well as our contemporary strengths, and pulling together a vehicle which will be more useful to us than the one that we are now engaged in. If anyone is satisfied with the status quo, I'm not aware of it, particularly our children.
Mr. Llewellyn, just very briefly, do you see this as a critical stage in the evolution of...
I swear, I do not know why people keep talking about what the container is called. It's what's the content of the container. This won't get us into the 21st century unless our kids can read, write, compute, and be able to compete in this country to make a living and to make progress. If that doesn't take place, we can put African American on them, we can put Negro on them, we can put anything you want to put on them, but they're not going to play the game in the 21st century because the field is getting tougher and tougher, and this not a level field.
Who says you know?
Wait, just a minute. Let me just we're about to run out of time. Mr. Ture, a final comment on that point.
The error of the thinking here is that most people think that Africans in America came here just like other immigrant groups did. All other immigrants came to America expecting a better way of life. We started in hell, which was a slave ship, and we're still in hell. This incorrect assumption makes it appear as if we've made a contribution with our culture. Our culture has been trampled upon, not the others. Any contribution we've made to America is the test of the strength of our culture in spite of this oppression. We are Africans, and that's exactly where we're going.
Is the term, in your view, is that where you end it? Is that where it stops?
The content was African. The label has been changed to confuse us. If we came here as Africans, how do we end up as Americans? How do we
I would beg to differ here that my ancestors came here in a slave boat. They didn't. They came from the island of Jamaica, and they came on their own because they thought it was a better place to be than Jamaica.
How did they get to Jamaica? They came as slaves to Jamaica. I was born in Trinidad. That's where the slave ship dropped them. We're all slaves.
Right.
We're all slaves.
We can't solve this one.
Jamaica. Who did you decide to drop in Jamaica? The white man dropped you in Jamaica and brought you to Mississippi. Right. So you don't define yourself by the enemy?
No, I define myself as the fighting places where I'm at, not where I used to be or where I thought I was.
So if you were fighting on a slave ship, so if you're fighting on a slave ship, we fought on the slave ships. We fought on the slave ships. Did you call yourself a warder?
And you're still fighting in 1989, right here in New York City.
And until Africa is free, we won't be free.
All right, one final practical note. Mr. Winter, you're the only editor here. How should the media deal with this? As you can see, there's a debate over the issue. What about newspapers, television, books, magazines? I mean, should they continue to use, Haki said he was going to continue to use both. I mean, what kind of guidance do you think should apply there?
Well, speaking immediately for newspapers, and again, while I don't represent directly the Wall Street Journal here, I can tell you that they have discussed this issue recently and concluded that they will wait and watch to take the general standard of what comes to be common usage among black people in general, as at least we'll call it now, and moreover among academics and political and social leaders and that sort of thing. And if a consensus appears to emerge, then style changes will probably be forthcoming at our paper. And I believe in fact the New York Times has said similar things, which is about all they can do, because to them it's, well, there's something going on there in the community and we don't really know what to make of it. All they want to know is that they really don't want to offend anyone in the end. If it becomes apparent that everybody wants this, then they'll likely go along, although they will use people of color in the media as sounding boards to make the decision.
Well, I'm sorry, we'll just have to wait and watch and see what happens because we're out of time. Ms. Elan in Washington, thank you for being with us. Mr. Winter, Mr. Llewellyn, and Mr. Ture.
Africans.
This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. As we continue our conversation with Nick Estes, author of Our History is the Future. The new book tells the history of indigenous resistance over 2 centuries, offering a roadmap for collective liberation and a guide to fighting life-threatening climate change. Estes centers this history in the historic fight against the Dakota Access Pipeline at Standing Rock. Nick Estes is assistant professor of American Studies at the University of New Mexico and co-founder of the indigenous resistance group, the Red Nation. He's a citizen of the Lower Brule Sioux tribe. Nick, thanks so much for staying with us for part 2 of the conversation. You begin your book with 2 Thanksgiving stories. Tell us each.
So the first Thanksgiving story begins with the Pequot Massacre by members of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, which really marks in my opinion, the mythology of the United States as a settler colonial country founded on sort of genocide to create, ironically, peace. And then I begin with another story of a prayer march that we led in the Bismarck Mall in Bismarck, North Dakota, to kind of bring attention to the Standing Rock struggle during a Black Friday shopping event, which was met by police armed with AR-15s, who then began punching and kicking water protectors who were holding a prayer in the Bismarck Mall. And I thought it was a really kind of jarring sort of contrast between the past and the present, to say that while there are sort of differences between the massacre of Pequots in Massachusetts to the contemporary sort of fight against an oil pipeline, nonetheless, Bismarck, North Dakota is a 90% white community that originally the Dakota Access Pipeline was supposed to go upriver from, but then was rerouted downriver to disproportionately affect the Standing Rock Sioux tribe. And disproportionate is the language that the Army Corps of Engineers use, as if there's ever a proportionate risk to environmental issues and water contamination. So at this particular moment, There weren't any actions that were happening in the camps, and it was largely at a standstill. And I think at that Thanksgiving weekend, there was an unthanksgiving feast that was held in the camps, and it was actually the highest point of the camps themselves, in the sense that there were the most sort of water protectors had showed up. So I thought it was a good kind of contrast to show that this history, is a continuing history of genocide, of settler colonialism, and basically the founding myths of this country.
Your book's last words are, we're challenged not just to imagine, but to demand the emancipation of Earth from capital. For the Earth to live, capitalism must die. Explain.
So that line is part of, this longer section on liberation. And I think when we think about climate change, oftentimes the question of climate change really centers on market-driven solutions, such as green capitalism, and how do we create markets that sort of incentivize transition to sustainable economies, right? And I think really what we're kind of like beating around the bushes is that it's the system of capitalism that led us into this economic crisis to begin with. It's the sort of designation of certain populations in certain territories as disposable that has led us into our current epoch of global climate change. And so when we talk about who's going to bear the most burden when we transition, out of the carbon economy, it most likely is going to be those populations that have historically been colonized. And what's happening in Southeast Africa is a perfect example of why we need to transition away from not just the carbon economy, but capitalist economies in general. Because if we look at the history of how Africa has been a resource colony for Europe and for North America, we can look internally in the United States and understand that indigenous nations continue to serve as resource colonies for the United States, whether it's the Navajo Nation, where I'm living right now, that is producing oil and coal to generate electricity for the Southwest region, or whether it's the Fort Berthold Reservation up in North Dakota, that is, the ground zero for oil and gas development in the Bakken region. We have to understand that indigenous nations have largely been turned into resource colonies and sites of sacrifice for not just the United States, but for the oil and gas industry. And so we need to not just think beyond climate change and putting carbon into the atmosphere, but we actually need to think about the system, the social system, right, that created those conditions in the first place. And so capitalism is fundamentally a social relation. It's a profit-driven system, whereas indigenous sort of ways of relating is one about reciprocity and mutual sort of respect, not just with the human, but also with the non-human world. And we're undergoing, the sixth massive extinction event, which is caused by not just climate change, but is caused by capitalist sort of systems and the profit-driven sort of motive of our current economic and social system.
Nick, last week, Democratic lawmakers grilled Wells Fargo CEO Timothy Sloan over the bank practices of predatory lending, misleading and defrauding customers, and its relationship to the NRA, private prisons, and the fossil fuel industry. This is New York Congressmember Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez questioning Sloan over the bank's role in climate change and its financial backing of the Dakota Access Pipeline, which, she noted, has leaked at least 5 times since it started transporting oil in 2017. This is AOC.
Should Wells Fargo be held responsible for the damages incurred by climate change due to the financing of fossil fuels and these projects?
I don't know how you'd calculate that, Congresswoman.
Say from spills, or when we have to reinvest in infrastructure, building seawalls from the erosion of infrastructure, or cleanups, wildfires, etc.
Related to that pipeline, I'm not aware that there's been any of what you described that's occurred related
How
to
about
that.
The cleanups from the leaks of the Dakota Access Pipeline?
I'm not aware of the leaks associated with the Dakota Access Pipeline.
So that is Wells Fargo CEO Timothy Sloan. Nick Estes, can you illuminate us on the leaks around the Dakota Access Pipeline since the Energy Transfer Partners succeeded in having it completely built, including digging under the Missouri River, the longest river in North America?
Right. So there have been 6 leaks. There was actually a leak when before the pipeline was actually finished, and they have to put oil in it before it's even finished. So there's oil sitting in it that started leaking, right? And since the Dakota Access Pipeline has been built, there have been 6 or more leaks, 6 that we know about. But we can look at the Keystone pipeline that was built not the Keystone XL, but the Keystone pipeline that was built in the eastern half of North Dakota and South Dakota, and it leaked over 500,000 gallons just outside the Sisseton-Wahpeton reservation in northeastern South Dakota, and that alone has the environmental damage to the land has not been sort of adequately assessed, and partially that has to do with the fact that there wasn't a cleanup response, an emergency cleanup response that was on site that could deal with it. I think it was reported, and it took several hours for the emergency management to sort of address it. And so when we talk about pipeline leaks, oftentimes industry is kind of peddling this myth that they will be, responsive, and they will be there within minutes of a pipeline leak. And oftentimes these leaks go on for hours, 8 hours sometimes, without even notice. And we don't even know the minor leaks that are happening in the oil pipelines. And so not only do pipelines leak, it's how they're transported in the first place. And even with cargo and rail transport, there's also a danger that they will, explode. So the risks of these pipelines are always externalized, as Ocasio-Cortez points out, onto the public to pay for them. And we can think about this in a global scale as well, and thinking about how the global South is really paying for the consumption of oil and gas in the global North, by experiencing the most devastating effects of climate change. And we can even go and look at why when Ilhan Omar questioned Elliot Abrams about his horrible human rights record in Latin America, and promoting sort of coup attempts elsewhere, we can make those connections with the current attempts of the Trump administration to overthrow the democratically elected government of Venezuela, is going back to the North American oil boom, which dropped the prices of oil across the globe in an attempt to not just boycott Venezuelan oil, but to actually strangle the Venezuelan economy. And so in many ways, the extraction and transportation of oil is directly linked to these sort of imperial projects abroad, where the United States is not only just interested in drilling its way out of the Great Recession, but it's using it as a political sort of way to continue its boycott of Venezuelan oil, but also the sanctions on Venezuela itself. And so I believe, Winona LaDuke, my friend, has made these connections in the past, but we have to think about these pipeline struggles in a global geopolitical context, as well as understanding that these pipelines are transporting oil oftentimes to a global market, and therefore they're transnational projects as well. And they're not just affecting the indigenous communities of where they're being built, but they're also affecting people throughout the globe.
I wanted to ask you about this growing resistance to pipeline after pipeline. You mentioned Winona LaDuke of the White Earth Reservation in northern Minnesota, who is also at Standing Rock. We interviewed her there. She had pitched her teepee in the Red Warrior camp. And she said, I'm not going to spend my life protesting one pipeline after another. Right. But what about this ongoing resistance to pipelines throughout the United States and Canada? I want to go to President Trump right after he was inaugurated, announcing the pair of presidential memorandums to revive the Keystone XL and Dakota Access Oil pipelines, the two major projects halted by the Obama administration following massive resistance from indigenous and environmental groups.
This is with regard to the construction of the Keystone pipeline, something that's been in dispute, and it's subject to a renegotiation of terms by us. we're going to renegotiate some of the terms, and if they'd like, we'll see if we can get that pipeline built. A lot of jobs, 28,000 jobs, great construction jobs. This is with respect to the construction of the Dakota Access Pipeline. Dakota Access Pipeline. Again, subject to terms and conditions to be negotiated by us.
So that is President Trump, newly inaugurated, announcing that he was moving forward with the Dakota Access Pipeline and he was reviving the Keystone XL. The significance of this, Professor Estes.
So if we go back to 2014, Obama was the one of 6 sitting presidents to actually visit an Indian reservation during his time in office, and he actually visited Standing Rock during their Flag Day powwow and met with then tribal chairman Dave Archambault III. And so he made a promise to youth at that particular powwow that he would, that we would put our minds together to make what's best for the future generations, citing Sitting Bull, one of the Lakota leaders of resistance in the 19th century. And, that the Dakota Access Pipeline, when it came, down from the Bakken oil region, it was those Standing Rock youth who ran to Washington, D.C., hoping that Obama would live up to his promise to listen to the youth, the indigenous youth. From what we know now, it's that we don't know if he was even listening. And so in many ways, Obama couldn't really halt the construction of the pipeline. Towards the end of his term, I know that there was an order to halt the construction and a mandated environmental review. But by and large, his administration was a failure to uphold sort of that promise to indigenous people. And so if Obama's administration is a failure, then the Trump administration is an absolute catastrophe for indigenous nations in the United States, because Trump has intensified the oil and gas extraction, not just in the Bakken region, but here in the Four Corners area, in the Permian Basin, in western Texas, and parts of New Mexico. Oil production has just, increased, and he's using the Bureau of Land Management to essentially sell off, sometimes for dollars on the acre, indigenous land, or public lands as we know it now, which is really just stolen indigenous land, to the highest bidder. And when we talk about pipelines, right, and we talk about oil and gas production, we really have to talk about the source of those pipelines. And here, in the Southwest region, it's the Permian Basin and the Four Corners region, where there's been extensive fracking and oil and gas development. But also what's happening now with the Keystone XL pipeline is very interesting. I'm from South Dakota, originally born and raised. And, the governor of South Dakota introduced, Kristi Noem, introduced a series of anti-protest legislation bills specifically targeting water protectors in South Dakota who may be protesting the Keystone XL pipeline. And the interesting thing about that, and we can go back to the Standing Rock protest, is that these states, have contentious relations with tribal nations to begin with, right? We didn't sign treaties with the state governments, but yet the state governments participate in the continued criminalization of indigenous people for trying to uphold our treaty rights. And so why are we criminals, and activists who are just trying to protect, land and water? And when we go back to the treaties, in like the 1868 Fort Laramie Treaty, which the Keystone XL pipeline contravenes and trespasses through treaty-protected territory of the Great Sioux Reservation, we're not asking the state of South Dakota to do anything radical. We're not asking non-Indigenous people to do anything radical. All we're asking them to do is to uphold their own constitution. Your government signed the 1868 Fort Laramie Treaty with us. It's your responsibility to uphold that treaty as well. And, you know, your own constitution says that treaties are the supreme law of the land. And what we're finding out with a lot of these ranchers and white communities is that they have no say over the construction of these pipelines. They have no say of whether or not they're going to be built on their land, because TransCanada is using state governments to condemn property and to create rights of way through their land. And so now they're turning to Indigenous communities, and they're turning to treaty rights and understanding that it's treaty rights, and specifically Indigenous rights, that really protect everyone's rights when it comes to environmental justice issues. And so while there is this kind of adverse effect of the continued criminalization of water protectors, whether it's in Louisiana, whether it's in North Dakota, or even in Canada with the eviction of the Unistoten resistance camp in Wet'suwet'en territory, or whether it's in South Dakota and the criminalization of water protectors there, we can understand that there's also a growing alliance with non-Indigenous communities who are seeing value in Indigenous rights and specifically treaty rights. And to me, that is the most hopeful sort of sign of this current resistance movement, is that Indigenous rights are at the forefront because they protect everybody's rights.
Nick Estes, you focus on 7 historical moments of resistance in your new book, Our History is the Future. You say they form a historical roadmap for collective liberation. How did you choose these histories? Just quickly take us through them.
Sure. So I begin at the camps. I begin in the present, at Standing Rock, and then I go to the fur trade with the first U.S. invasion, which was Lewis and Clark, who trespassed through our territory and were stopped by our leadership. And then I go through the Indian Wars of the 19th century and the Buffalo Genocide, and then I go into talking about the damming of the Missouri River in the mid-20th century, and then looking at Red Power in the 1960s and the 1970s, and how all of these Indigenous people who were relocated because their lands were flooded by these dams eventually found themselves and created sort of the modern Indigenous movement known as Red Power, and then going back and ending actually at Standing Rock in 1974 with the creation of the International Indian Treaty Council, which really coalesced these generations of Indigenous resistance and took the treaties, the 1868 Fort Laramie Treaty, to the world and to the United Nations. And to do that, they looked to Palestinians, they looked to the South African anti-apartheid movement, who provided the mechanisms for recognition of Indigenous rights at the United Nations. And that all resulted over 4 decades in the touchstone document, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which was passed by the UN in 2007. And so in many ways, when we look at Standing Rock and we go down Flag Row and we see the hundreds of tribal nation flags that were represented in 2016 and 2017, we also saw the Palestinian flag that was there, kind of hearkening back to that international solidarity with movements of the global South, and specifically our Palestinian relatives who, today are still facing, much like us, are still facing the brunt and the brutality of settler colonialism, whether it's the United States recognizing the annexation of the Golan Heights, or whether it's, here in North America and the continued dispossession of Indigenous territory and rights. We can see that settler colonialism in Israel or in Palestine is really an extension of settler colonialism in North America. And then I end, with back at the camps and looking at how these camps really provided, I actually look at a physical map that was handed out to water protectors who came to the camp. And on that map, there was, where to find food, where to find the clinics, right? And where to find the security and all the camps that were represented at at Standing Rock. And to me, that provided, a kind of interesting parallel to the world that surrounded the camps, which was some 92 different law enforcement jurisdictions. You had the North Dakota National Guard, the world of cops, the world of the militarized sort of police state. And in the camps themselves, you had sort of the primordial sort of beginnings of what a world premised on indigenous justice might look like. And in that world, everyone got free food. There was a place for everyone. The housing, obviously was transient housing and teepees and things like that. But then also there was health clinics to provide healthcare, alternative forms of healthcare to everyone. And so if we look at that, it's housing, education, all for free, right? A strong sense of community. And for a short time, there was free education at the camps, right? Those are things that most poor communities in the United States don't have access to, and especially reservation communities. But given the opportunity to create a new world in that camp centered on indigenous justice and treaty rights, society organized itself according to need and not to profit. And so where there was, the world of settler colonialism that surrounded us, there was the world of indigenous justice that existed for a brief moment in time. And in that world, instead of doing to settler society what they did to us, genociding, removing, excluding, there's a capaciousness to indigenous resistance movements that welcomes in non-indigenous peoples into our struggle, because that's our primary strength, is one of relationality, one of making kin, right?
Nick Estes, Assistant Professor of American Studies at the University of New Mexico, author of the new book, Our History is the Future, Standing Rock versus the Dakota Access Pipeline and the Long Tradition of Indigenous Resistance. He's co-founder of the indigenous resistance group, the Red Nation, and a citizen of the Lower Brule Sioux Tribe. To see part one of our conversation, go to DemocracyNow.org. I'm Amy Goodman. Thanks so much for joining us.
Chat. You can also post them in the Facebook chat, and through Zoom you can also share them here. And so we want to do quick introductions. There's such a great opportunity here in this space to get to know folks here and have this discussion on film by our comrade Kwame Ture, as well as Nick Estes with the Red Nation. So we just want to pass the mic over and have folks introduce themselves. You can share your name as well as your organization. And I see audio's connecting for a couple of people. Audio still connecting for a few people, and so I'm going to pass to my comrade Hope. If you would introduce yourself in the space and your organization as well. Thank you so much.
Good morning. Hi, everybody. My name is Hope. I am also known as Citizen in my community. I'm currently the chair of the Southwest Freedom Council of the Red Nation here in Tewa Territories. Nice to be here. Really happy to be on this Zoom call and to have watched the panel, the film series.
Thank you, Hope. Others are still joining. I believe it's Albie. If I'm mispronouncing it, please correct me.
You got that one correct. Albie Walls. I'm in the Ghana chapter of the All African People's Revolutionary Party. And so I'm also happy to be here. Unfortunately, I may not be able to stay long. It's 10 p.m. here. And so I can't promise I'll be online throughout the discussion, but I'm very happy that you all are organizing the program. This is actually the third tribute today that I've been participating in. I was in London earlier today and also in Senegal. So I'm flying around quite a bit today, but I'm very happy to be here. Thank you.
Thank you so much for being here, comrade, and we're excited that anytime you have to share and any wisdom to share in this space is so valuable. Stephanie?
Hi, thank AAPRP and the Nation for all the contributions that you all make on a regular basis to our collective liberation and healthy society, and I'm excited to learn more today.
We have two others with us, and it looks like their audio is still connecting, and throughout, once they're connected, can introduce themselves in the space. And so let's have a discussion on the first film that we saw. So the panel that talked about what's in a name. I'm going to turn it over to Gabby, and we also want to acknowledge that Kwame Ture is the anniversary of our comrade's passing on November 15th, and so this is a very timely space to uplift him in his contributions to African Revolution. Gabby?
Hi, thank you. So I wanted to inform us a little bit about Kwame Ture and who he was. He was originally born Stokely Carmichael. He was a critical leader in the Pan-Africanism movement focused on African liberation. He popularized the term Black Power. He had leadership in the Student Nonviolence Coordinating Committee, SNCC, to denounce Zionist aggression against Palestinian and Arab people during the 1967 Israeli war. And he was an organizer in the struggle for our people to constantly resist against the racist, oppressive system. So the first question that I have, based on the video that we watched, what are your reflections on each identity shared by the panelists?
Leighton, are you trying to speak?
Oh, I came in late. If I think I've seen this clip before, though. I thought what was better. The one that point used call himself, but he called himself African.
You cut in and out there. Yeah. You cut in and out there, but I think we caught a little bit of what you shared.
Oh, okay. I was saying if it's the clip that I had seen before, it was where he was saying that he once used the term black, and that it was good for what it accomplished, but that he had since evolved to calling himself African. Would recommend for diaspora people to call themselves African as well.
Thank you so much for sharing. I definitely agree.
And I agree with that because
sorry, you were speaking. You said you agree with that because?
Yeah, man. And I was saying that of the East and what the inspired, but talk the really, if you wish, African nest, how you split the African nest between persons who were taken, whose ancestors were taken to, say, Jamaica, but whose descendants migrate to the United States of America. You know, could they account for Marcus Garvey, Malcolm? You know, we're Africans.
Thank you so much for sharing. And
that's my 2 cents.
Thank you so much for sharing.
Or 22 cents.
We caught a little bit of what you shared, as well as bringing in Marcus Garvey as well. There's a comment in Facebook that I believe is similar to some of the things you were sharing. It says, "We are African. Black is a collective name that we have embraced because it locates us within the orbit of white supremacy, close to the massive symbols like his and her personal names." You know, for me, for the longest time, I think maybe I was 8 years old when I didn't know how to identify, and I knew I wasn't American. It was very clear that I had no identity to that name whatsoever, but I didn't know as a child like what it meant to be African, and so I identified as Black for a very long time. And like, it makes total sense to be connected to our people and connected to, you know, our heritage. And so of course I'm African. That's where my people come from. That's my heritage. That's my legacy. That's who I am. And so it makes sense now to me at such a young age. I couldn't figure out how to identify, and it was because like the term Black was really elevated, and that was the closest term to me that I could be connected to. And now African is something that I'm really proud to be called. Other thoughts on the question Gabby shared, I'll also post it in the chat. And you can also make comments as well in the Facebook comment section if you have thoughts on that question. Gabby, you want to move to the next question? And also, everybody in the discussion can ask questions as well.
My next question is, what are examples of how this country excludes the African community?
I think,
hello?
Yes. One thing that I think about the exclusion is it was brought up in the discussion from the panelists too. So like Jay, and I'm trying to think of it, Jay and Leon were wanting to like be brought into this country and identify with this country, and like they had this, they would say things like, we built this system and we want a piece of the pie, and we want to be, you know, we want to be connected to it, and we want to have some type of identity that's connected to American. Yeah, that was funny to me too. I was laughing as well. And so there's no place, like historically, where we've ever been included. We've always been harmed. You know, our people were kidnapped. Our people are still continue to be kidnapped into the prison industrial complex. our people are still exploited. They're still exploited here, they're still exploited in Africa. So, like, no matter what, examples of how they exclude us is in everything. Like, the system is embedded in racism. The system is embedded in oppression. And so we are never meant, us and indigenous people as well as other colonized folks, we're never meant to be part of this country. And so they build barriers, intentional barriers, to keep us excluded, whether that's in the education system, the prison system, they like pumping drugs into our neighborhoods to exclude us, right? So I think they use so many ways or forms through systematic racism and capitalism to exclude us. What are some of your thoughts about how we're excluded? Or others?
Well, in Jamaica,
Legion, I'm so sorry, I'm probably saying your name wrong. Your comments are, your internet's going in and out. Would you like to type it in the chat so we could share it? We don't want to miss everything you're sharing. But you said in Jamaica and then we didn't catch the rest.
Yes, I was saying, I'll check if you can. We do have if and Jamaican, he's Jamaican, they say he's Jamaican. If they're Lebanese Jamaican, they're Lebanese. But if you Afro, oh, you're. So it's is many people. They use melting pot to subsume the majority. Don't say whereas all ethnic identities are this is a Chinese dish. Chicken chops is that this is what have you African tradition, just Jamaican. That's boo about mentioning anything African, celebrating anything African, distinctly, uniquely African. That's it.
Thank you. You were sharing about the Jamaican identity, and I don't think we were able to hear everything you were sharing. But if you type it in the chat, we'll make sure that your comments are being shared, publicly with everyone who's watching. Stephanie shared something in the chat as well. I see Hope, my chat's not loading, but it said this country was built off of the very ideology that sustains white supremacy around the world. Definitely, for sure. If you want to elaborate on that, Hope, you're more, please feel free to do so. Stephanie, my chat's not loading all the way, and I know you shared something in the comment. Okay, it says, I wonder if the desire to feel they are valued players of the chessboard through colonized ancestors who have been sacrificed by the empire rather than acknowledge they were pawns who will never be protected or covetous, bond, sacrificial pieces is a trauma response. Interesting. We always talk about how decolonizing is traumatizing to see the cruel reality. Desire is probably not a strong enough description. It's almost a survival grip to the idea. Interesting. Yeah, definitely. I see Hope nodding as well. So yeah, it's really interesting because you know, when you listen to Jay and Leon, they seem a little bit disconnected versus like Ramona, you know, really trying to embrace their African heritage. Ramona embracing African heritage and identity. It felt like I think it just bought into that like system that you can be anything and do anything and move up in the world, and it's like more of like this individualism versus collectivism, you know, and it's like I just want a piece of that. I just want to climb this ladder. I just want to get there. And it's also like connected to trauma. Like I definitely agree with what you're saying, Stephanie, and not being seen as like tools and pawns. Because one thing they could definitely agree on is the harm done to Africans and the suffering that was done to Africans, our ancestors here. And so it seemed that there was an agreement there, but then there was a disconnect about like being connected to like American identity. And like who would want to be connected to American identity? Like they're full of like genocide and turmoil continuously, repeatedly. They've never stopped doing it. So no, I don't want to be connected to that identity at all. I want to be connected to my people.
Yeah, I just wanted to just echo too what you're saying, Monique. I think that that's really important. Is I mean, I have a lot of feelings. So I just want to say that at first too. Like I think that there's a lot to unpack in the videos that we watched, and I think that it's a really important conversation that needs to continue to be had as we are critiquing like U.S. empire and the ways that U.S. empire has wreaked havoc on our communities inside of the United States, but also like abroad. And I think that's something too that a lot of our communities struggle with. Not just like I'll speak for like my community, like as Native people, for example. Like I feel like it's very difficult for Native people sometimes to see empire as like a colonial force. It really is. It's interesting like to see what colonialism has done and continues to do to our people. And it really always like bothers me to see people justify the violence of U.S. empire, not just like abroad, but here in our communities as well. And I think that it's a really important conversation to have about like nationalism, and something that's like that I'm thinking about is how do you like I really want to urge people to think about like how do you begin to imagine your life like on stolen land with like people who like a community that is looking to also separate ourselves from like U.S. empire, but also like as people inside the belly of the beast to target this institution and really like bring to the forefront some of the really violent ways that some of our communities are adopting this like really colonial identity and colonial like empire and like nationalism even. I struggle like when I've traveled outside of the U.S. I want to like call myself like Dinesh because like being here into a territory is like I don't call myself American, and I don't call myself Native American, and I don't like it when people call me American, and I don't like even calling this country the United States, because we have names for these homelands, and like this, like the land has always been here, and every community, every indigenous community has names for each part of the land, and we have names for each other. And so like for me, it's like thinking about all of this history and all of this knowledge that is basically being written over, like this revisionist history that the United States is conditioning all of our people and our communities to. And it just really, it gets me really upset and frustrated But it's also like, it's hard because just in the past few days, like we've seen the elections unfold, we've seen like our communities, you know, picking, or I should say like finding themselves in like this, the conversation around the lesser of two evils, and like this conversation that where we're like justifying like an authoritarian regime, colonial regime on stolen lands here in occupied indigenous territories, and people are telling us to choose sides, like choose like Democratic or Republican. And like as an indigenous person myself, like it's very difficult for me to like just tear myself up in all of these different pieces. And I just want to like, I would love to just see the fall of U.S. empire, and I would love to build to that, and I want to encourage like my comrades to do that, and I want to encourage everybody to do that work, to whether that's like aligning yourselves with like revolutionary organizations and communities that support you, or just doing that like internal political work and like reading about the different struggles, and really even just reading about the disasters from like U.S. empire, I think is extremely important for how we can understand how we live on like stolen land here in our communities, because what's happening there is happening here. And I think that identity is very like I want to talk about class, you know, like I want to talk about working class people and poor people and colonized people coming together, because we're in a pandemic and we're all struggling, and how do we build together and help each other, especially like as we're going in lockdown, etc., and knowing that our communities are some of the most impacted. So I was kind of all over the place, but I just wanted to say thank you for giving me a little space to kind of share like my reflections on the films that we watched, and I did want to like say something too. I didn't know when to speak, but I wanted to speak to the other like issue that was brought up, like the first question around like Standing Rock and around the work that indigenous people are doing right now to like the land back movement, for example, that rejects U.S. empire, but also like creates space and creates room for other like people to belong here and to align themselves with like indigenous peoples and indigenous communities versus U.S. empire. And really like just thinking back onto Standing Rock, memories I think have been like overflowing inside our social medias the past few months, because just several years ago on this day, and in this time frame, there was just so much violence happening in Standing Rock. And as Nick had said throughout his discussion with Democracy Now, like it's really frustrating because we're consistently having to prove our humanity, and not just the humanity of ourselves, but also the humanity of the earth and the humanity, or like the livingness, I guess, of like our non-human relatives on this earth too. And Standing Rock was such an important revolutionary moment for me to be able to plug into this work, but also to become radicalized as a young person to do this work, and to like start to basically deconstruct all of the conditioning of U.S. empire that I had been taught. And really what it comes down to is our people are going to have to at some point understand that we benefit, right? We benefit, there's like conditioning, but we benefit from like moments where we align ourselves with like U.S. empire and patriotism, etc., and that we're going to actively have to like intentionally and knowingly like refuse those benefits when we're able to align ourselves more with our communities and with our people. And like that's very broad, I think, and kind of super theoretical. Like I'm not telling anybody to like refuse benefits or anything. Like if you can get like a food box, you get a food box. Like if you can get support, you get support. What I'm saying is that like I shouldn't have to sit here and say that I'm a U.S. citizen or that I'm an American to be treated like a human. And I shouldn't have to say also that I'm indigenous and that like I'm tribally enrolled just to say that like my family deserves food. And like nobody should have to say those things. And like I think that that's really important for like our communities to hear, is that they need to just remember like who they're aligning themselves with, and to remember that like yes, we can like mutual aid, like we've always taken care of each other, we've always saved ourselves. And U.S. empire just like has these little, I don't know, moments where you can, there's like a word for it, but I cannot remember. But I just want to like encourage people to align themselves with indigenous people and like to not align yourself with like colonizers and like the colonial regimes and the structures that are in place currently too, and that like to remember that this is stolen land and that like all of our struggles are intersecting, and our liberation really takes like it's our liberation. It's not just like indigenous people's liberation or like certain folks' liberation. Like it's all of our liberation.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing. It's making me reflect on, like, you shared a lot of different things, and one thing you shared about was like political education and how that's so important, and that's something that Kwame Ture, really talked about as well, is like that political education and how that's going to help lead us to our African liberation. And I also reflect on, like, you're sharing about how we depend on each other, right? And that's something that we also share is, like, we got us. Like, the only way we're going to get there is through a grassroots effort, like supporting one another, because this country does not care if we live or die, but we care about one another. We care about our communities. And so thank you for sharing those comments about, and so it's making me reflect a lot. I think Gabby has one more question for this section, and then we're going to move to the next, the second film.
Yes. Why will self-identifying as African help unify all descendants of the African diaspora?
Albie, do you mind if I call on you and see if you're wanting to share about this question about why would self-identifying as African help us to unify all descendants of the African diaspora?
Okay, I'll give it a shot here. Having not been living in the diaspora for a while, I'm a little bit rusty, but on some of the perspectives, I think, of living and experiencing living in the diaspora. But I think, for me, the simplest or the most obvious reason would be the opportunity to build some unity. The fact that when we identify as all of these different, with all of these different terms and nationalities and ethnicities, it makes it much more difficult for us to see our commonalities. And we tend to focus more on the differences and what makes us unique as someone from this part of the world or someone of this religious or ethnic persuasion, and rather than looking at the commonalities. Actually, I was on a Kwame Ture tribute yesterday that was based on an online radio program based here in Accra, but the participants were global, and one of the hosts in the studio here in Accra, the question was about Pan-Africanism, does it still resonate, particularly with young people? And one of the persons in the studio here in Accra was concerned or felt that there wasn't enough of a bond between, for example, let me just be straight, that she was feeling like Africans on the continent were identifying and recognizing the oppression of African people outside in the diaspora, particularly with the George Floyd, Black Lives Matter situation where there are demonstrations held on the across the continent of Africa in solidarity and in support of those, the anti-racist activities going on in the U.S. But she didn't feel like it was mutual. She didn't feel like Africans in the diaspora were as in tune and as supportive of the struggles on the continent. Now, unfortunately, I didn't really have much of an opportunity to reply in that setting or at that time, but I wanted to point out for her that that's part of the way in which we're divided, because the control of the narrative, the control of the information is such that she doesn't see all of the efforts that take place outside of Africa that are linked directly to what's going on in Africa, even with among young people. And it's been that way for many, many years, from hundreds of years, I would say at least 100 years, where, for example, when, I guess it was about almost 100 years ago when Italy invaded Ethiopia, and Africans in the diaspora came to actually fight to defend Ethiopia, called Abyssinia at that time. So that was one example. Then, of course, you could have many others. The anti-apartheid movement, which had a very large, that's how many people of my generation got involved in the struggle for Pan-Africanism, many of us, because of the anti-apartheid movement, which was largely, focused or impacted by the activities of Africans in the diaspora to support the anti-apartheid movement. And then today we have, the end SARS, hashtag SARS kind of thing going on outside of that. But again, that's not typically something that we on the continent are exposed to, because the information sources are controlled by imperialism, so they don't want us to see that there is solidarity among African people for the struggles that take place globally. So you see, even for example, when the Black Lives Matter and the demonstrations in support of the George Floyd situation, we saw massive demonstrations in Hungary, in Korea, in Japan, but you didn't see the ones in Accra, in Lagos, in Nairobi, again, for that reason. So you might conclude, if you're relying on these predominantly imperialist controlled information sources, you would conclude that there isn't that solidarity, but it was taking place. And so it's incumbent upon those of us who know and have access to that information to share it, so that we can build that kind of unification or unity of recognition of our commonalities. But I think that, again, it's a roundabout way of, I guess, hopefully trying to address the question about the self-identification process and why it's necessary to go to the root, in terms of this African identity. It will cut across all of these kinds of boundaries. And so when we see something going on in Haiti or Jamaica or London or Minneapolis, we'll recognize that this is something that's the same thing that's happening in, on the continent of Africa. The same scenario, the same players are involved in terms of the oppressor and the oppressed. So sorry for the kind of rambling, but that's what comes to mind.
Thank you so much I knew you were going to drop knowledge. No, that wasn't rambling at all. That was a really great analysis of who's controlling the narrative and what does it mean to be unified? How do we elevate what that means and seeing? And you're right. Only reason I saw solidarity that was happening in Africa is because I'm on African in spaces, like in Facebook, or I have comrades that live in Africa. I rarely saw those things being publicized like other countries, and I didn't even make the connect that was intentional. So of course it's intentional. So thank you for sharing that. That was really important. Is there others who would like to respond to that? So we're going to, let me see if there's anything in the Facebook comments. If not, we're going to transition to our second film, which was, again, an interview with Nick Estes, who is a member of the Red Nation. So it's a collective of non-Native activists, educators, students, and organizers advocating for Native liberation. Of course, Hope is here and could give a breakdown of the Red Nation. And the book that was being shared was about, talking about the historical continued harm and genocide, and even like Nick even shared in there, like this country cannot even adhere to their own treaties in that space. And it was focused on the DAPA, so the Dakota Access Pipeline. So the first question that we have for folks here is, how has settler colonialism and genocide still perpetuated in this country?
I'm more than happy to start out this conversation. So, how is settler colonialism and genocide still perpetuated in this country? Well, it's embedded in every waking day and breath that this country continues to exist and live, and not only like wreak havoc on like our communities, but also like other communities. Settler colonialism is alive in our schools. It's alive in our like our workplace, our jobs, every part of our lives. Is there like a form of settler colonialism? And I think it's really important to understand settler colonialism as not just like one historic event, because I think a lot of people have framed it that settler colonialism is like, oh, the point of contact when like this first started, and it's like, no, it's actually a continuous event. It's a more like a structure. It's more like an institution. The United States is, in a lot of ways, I would say, a great example of what a settler colonial regime is. Another one would be like Israel. And I think that like it's very apparent in our lives. Like settler colonialism is a huge word, and I think like just breaking it down, like when we're talking about not being able to feed our families and not being able to feed our kids, and not being able, like our kids in schools, not even making sure if they have the like technology to be able to like learn from home, if they have access to like running water or warmth at home, like all of these things are questions that I think like we have and that we think about, and that like our communities are forced to think about, because there are things that we are not given freely in these communities on stolen land. People aren't given like shelter freely. People aren't given access to water and food freely. Whereas like if we lived in a decolonial society, like if we lived in like ancestrally inside the territories of the peoples who caretake these territories, people would be fed, people would be housed, people would be clothed, people would be taken care of, because that's what we do for our guests. And so like our struggle is just an example, I would say, of like the reality that we live in like settler colonial society. Like the fact that we're not able to take care of ourselves and our people is an example of settler colonialism. And I mean, there's many ways that we can break that down into like very specific things when we talk about racism and white supremacy, or when we talk about like water rights and land rights, to even just like gender inclusivity, just gender rights even, like all of those things are like tied together. And I think it's really important to understand settler colonialism as a structure, first and foremost, because then that helps to understand the ways in which like we've been conditioned to think like that this is normal or that this is okay. Like living on occupied territories, stolen territories, is like not normal, it's not okay. And then on top of that, like people living occupied and colonized is not okay. Like our people are exploited, our people are essentially like, yeah, just conditioned to be given crumbs and to be okay with it. And that's something that's really heartbreaking, but also like a daily like reality. And so like when I was talking earlier about like asking people to like break those alignments to like U.S. empire, like breaking the alignments to like holidays, or breaking your alignments to like celebrating 4th of July, you know, like things like that. Like those are ways that we pretend that we don't live under a settler colonial regime. Those are ways that we plug out and like just slip into these like really like neoliberal like spaces and thoughts of being like, yeah, you know, I guess things are okay, and it's like, no, it's not. Like, there are people out there who are really struggling right now, and we're struggling a lot of the times, but we're trying to figure out how to survive too. And so I think like it's really important to understand that we are occupied on stolen lands right now, and like we will continue to live in a system that upholds settler colonialism and genocide as long as we live under the United States.
Thank you, Hope. When you were talking about like celebrating holidays, right? I was really proud of my son today. He's just trying to figure out like the days of the week and the months and what's coming up, and he was like, Mom, so the next holiday is no thanks, no giving. And so what's the next holiday after that? You know, and I'm like, yeah, you know, for him to be able to recognize that there's no such thing as how this country has made that day be, that it's all a falsehood, it's not real, and being able to learn the truth, right, about what that day represents. And what you're just sharing, that day is continuous. It's not one day, it's not one event. And so that's something that I look forward to breaking down with him, as he's also, you know, Indigenous as well, and we have to talk about those things. And then something that someone had shared, and they're Indigenous and they organize at Generation Justice, and I was listening to them and they were on a panel, and they said how devastating it is for them to see their Indigenous relatives with no housing, and this is their land. And we know how in the winter months our Indigenous relatives often lives are lost because they're on the street with no shelter, and this is their land, right? That's continued genocide, like you were sharing. And one thing it was connecting me with is when Nick was sharing, saying at Standing Rock, there was housing, there was education, there was healthcare, like all the needs were met. You know, they were able to meet everyone's needs and provide those needs, you know, and all those things are blocked because of capitalism and imperialism. And so that's what it makes me think of when you were sharing those components. The next question is a little bit also something that Nick was sharing on the show, how does settler colonialism in Israel similar to settler colonialism here in this country? Gabby, would you like to share some? Because I know you had some thoughts on this question as well. And I know, Hope, this is a lot of work that you all do, Solidarity with Palestine, so please also answer as well. Please feel free to respond.
I'm not as informed as I'd like to be on this topic, but I appreciated how it was brought up, because I understand that the Palestinians had land and they were living there prior to the Israeli occupation. So it's the same example of people being removed and being displaced and being killed for the sake of another community of people who weren't originally there. And so it parallels. So that's the extent of my knowledge.
So I wanted to just add that I mean, I'm very I would consider myself very blessed to have been able to go to Palestine and see a lot of the resistance efforts by the community myself, and so that's really great. But really just answering the question, so I think I actually have a lot of conversations with folks in my community, and TRN has a lot of conversations with like the community as well around how settler colonialism, not just like in Israel, but also here, has manifested in ways across. And I don't think that we started it. That's like something too. Is like settler colonialism is a project that has been carried out for for a long time. And I think like some of the most recent examples historically are like in a case like Israel, where they are on occupied Palestinian territories and are enacting, I know they use the terms like ethnic cleansing and extreme violence, but I'm going to say genocide, like outright genocide and violence upon Palestinian peoples who are the original peoples, like peoples who were there, who have always been there, and there's like just like Turtle Island, several different communities, several different cultural communities and languages, etc., that are spoken across these regions. And settler colonialism, as it does with anything, is really important to like talk about and to analyze, because the ways in which the United States and Israel in particular work together is something that I think needs to be like always like consistently talked about, because they like help each other, they aid each other in colonizing. Like, as you know, like our police are sent on like deadly exchange programs to learn how to like, you know, do policing and kill people in Palestine, and then sent back here after they're done over there shooting like Palestinian communities, children and families. They come back here into our communities and enact the same violence. Same thing with like our weaponry. A lot of that weaponry that we have inside the United States is actually tested on Palestinian communities in Israel, in so-called Israel. I don't even like to say Israel. I remember inside, when I was in Palestine, we would say like inside 48, I believe, to refer to Israel, because we straight up, and this is like how powerful it was to exist in that space and in that moment, in that like revolutionary moment, with like Palestinian communists who were like, we refuse to acknowledge that empire. We refuse to acknowledge our colonizers. We refuse to name their so-called country. And that same sentiment, like I really felt like it just really like impacted me, because that's exactly how I feel about the United States. And like the two projects, the ways in which that they exist, the ways in which they participate in the forced removal of original peoples, and then the replacement of those communities, and the extreme violence that it takes throughout this process. Every part of the process of removal, I think, is extremely important. And so like there's a lot of similarities between the United States and Israel, and in a lot of ways they actually complement each other and work well together to enact like extreme violence and imperialism throughout the world. And the ways in which that they strategically like target specific communities, specific like revolutionary movements across the globe, where people are rising up together, where masses of people are coming together to address violence. And even within like the confines of those so-called like settler like countries, right? Like so-called the United States, so-called Israel, like the people are still resisting, and we're going to continue to exist and resist. And I think that it's really important to say that like just as like our struggles here are just as connected to folks in Palestine, because like until like the United States is removed from this like our soil, we are not liberated, just as Palestinians will not be liberated until Israel is removed from their spaces. And I think that like we in the Red Nation, we've had several conversations, and I would ask people regarding like what is our like indigenous, like for example, like the Red Nation, like indigenous like solidarity with like Palestine. Like we have a lot of different writings on our page, and I encourage people to like look at those things and look at the writings between the like communities that are impacted by like settler colonialism, which is all of us, right? To like look at those things and read them, because you'll see more often than not how similar all of our colonizers are, and that should be the reasons for us coming together and unifying to be able to overthrow those colonizers as the oppressed peoples. And so that's like, I use that to just say like, yeah, like, okay, the colonizers are the same. They're totally the same. They're very similar. Colonizing.
Definitely. Thank you so much for that analysis. We're going to read a question and our comment in the chat, and then Gabby's going to be asking our last question for this session. So it says, the things settler colonialism has in common across all contexts: Tanzania, Algeria, Zimbabwe, Israel, the U.S., Australia, is the need to exterminate the indigenous people. Very common thing that they do. That's what colonizers are. Like you said, Hope, earlier, that they're colonizers. Gabby, turning it over to you.
Thank you. I have my next question. I wanted to ask because Nick Estes brought up a term that I was unfamiliar with, and that was the sixth massive extinction event. And so I looked that up, and it said that it's currently happening not just because of climate change, but because of Nick said that it was happening because of the climate change, not just because of climate change, but because of the existence of capitalistic system. So I looked up what it meant, and it said that 500 species of animals have become extinct. This might be the tipping point for the collapse of civilization, and that according to the UN Convention on Biological Diversity Research, says that 10% of different species become extinct each decade. So that was a moment of concern that I had when I read that. And then he mentioned he mentioned the term green capitalism, and supposedly we're supposed to be going green to help with things like the sixth massive extinction event. But why is green capitalism still not a solution to proactive environmentalism? This is my question.
Can you actually restate that? Oh, okay, there it is.
Yeah.
I posted the wrong one. I'm sorry. Gabby, could you restate your question?
Yes. So why is green capitalism still not a solution to proactive environmentalism?
All right, thank you. So green capital. Well, okay. So capitalism is capitalism, and it'll never work. It's not like capitalism. Capitalism is a system that will never benefit not only the masses, but like especially the earth and our non-human relatives. And so green capitalism is just like, I mean, it's something that we see, I think, really often inside like, the United States is like just neoliberalism, like a lot of this understanding like, oh, we're just going to like recycle and reuse, and like you can't like just eat healthier, and the like extractivist projects that are contaminating all of our communities and our aquifers are going to disappear from you eating healthier. But also like we can't just trade out certain things, like everything inside, like I think that it's really important to understand that like indigenous peoples have learned how to coexist with the world, with like non-human relatives, and with the earth in a way that is sustainable. And that is something that I think we can all learn from indigenous people all over the world. And so that being said, like capitalism is anti-indigenous. Capitalism is the ways in which we commodify like our own relatives to like produce like money, which is like a really Western concept, to just like keep flourishing like all of this the bigger industries and structures in place that are honestly like oppressing us and colonizing us. And I think like in this specific moment, there's like this question really reminds me of like the Green Deal versus like the Red Deal. And so like in the Green Deal, it like everything that you're hearing sounds nice. Like, yes, that sounds great. Like, yeah, let's go green. Like, let's recycle more and let's like take better care of the earth. But like what people need to understand is there are very specific things that need to be done in order to do those things. And capitalism is not it, period. Well, and I think that the sooner we like understand that and like and really start to like analyze that within our communities, the better. And the Red Nation has proposed the Red Deal as an alternative for us to understand not only our place in this world, but also for us to understand the ways in which like extractive industries, for example, or the police, the prison industrial complex, etc., all create like these like flows of money that keep like this colonial system going. And what I'm seeing people do is to just make it green. Like what I'm seeing people do inside media is like, let's just make it green. And it's frustrating because it's like, no, what we actually need to do is get rid of extractive industries. And like that means getting rid of your money. But you know what? Like for us to live, capitalism must die. For us to live, for our people to live, for the non-human relatives to live, for the water to be clean, for our children to drink, then we need to get rid of extraction. We need to get rid of these institutions and structures that essentially do exactly the opposite of what we're wanting. And we can't just go at the little baby issues of like, okay, well, like a little bit of water here that's contaminated, or a little bit of water there. Like, no, like we can target these big infrastructures and structures that are really spearheading this violence. And I think that's what I'm trying to get at, is that like we really, really need to get rid of those things. And for us to be able like to also understand that like so in the Red Nation we talk about often how like we only have maybe 10 years before some of the things that we have always known about and loved and cared for are might not be here. And like something that really, really gets to me personally, and I'm going to share this with you all too, is that like there are stories of like ceremonies in certain regions of our homelands that where there's like certain ceremonies that have always taken place because it's always just been that way. And the landscape is changing because of climate change at such a drastic like rate that there are such significant changes within those ceremonies or within those regions that it completely alters like some of the things, like the values that we've always known. And that's really scary because like when you hear about in let's say Dene territory out in like what's so-called known as like Alaska and Gwich'in territories, when you hear about elders literally melting and falling through the ice in ceremonial sites that have never not been frozen, like it shatters something inside of you to know that this is like also the state of the world. This is like what we're grappling with. Like we know that we know that the earth is sick because of capitalism, and people don't understand that like capitalism is why people like certain things have money, and capitalism is really pushing like these industries within our communities, and we have to get rid of those things. And it's a really hard conversation I think to have with our folks. But like the reality is capitalism isn't going to serve us at all. And for capitalism to like die, that means that that's finally a time where our people can rebuild and start to grow. And until we get to a point where we get rid of those structures of capitalism and imperialism more broadly, then like we still just got a lot of work to do. And green capitalism is not where it's at. That's just not where it's at. And please go check out the red dill and check out the green dill. Look at both of them and see like both of them side by side and the difference between them, because one of them is a really pretty picture that we would definitely want, a utopic idea without what it takes and what it needs to get there. And the red dill gives you a platform and understanding of what we need to do to get there.
Thank you so much, Hope. Thank you all so much for being here. What you're just elevated is something we were talking about this week, I believe, in a PRP work study, is about like what will our world look like in 10 years. We're going to be in a huge famine. You know, where our land and our air and our water is going to look very differently because of the harm, like you were saying, our earth is sick. And so we have and if we keep moving, if this country keeps moving at the pace that it is through capitalism, so many of us, even continuously, are going to be harmed. So definitely check out the Green Deal on the Red Nation's website versus the Green Deal, and you can definitely see the difference that the Red Deal is very more. Thank you. Did I say that wrong? Thank you, Hope. Check out the Red Deal on the Red Nation website. Thank you for correcting me. As well as the Green Deal, and you'll see which one is really embedded in humanity, is really embedded in our land, our water, our air, and our people. They're very different. So we're going to be concluding the film series today. Thank you so much. Gabby, you want to share with them a little bit more about when the film series occurs?
Yes, it happens every second Saturday of the month between 2 and 4 o'clock.
And also next week, which happens every Thursday, is our Pan-African Weekly News. Please join us. We're always sharing so much knowledge, dropping truth, and really giving a Pan-African perspective. That's every Thursday, Mountain Standard Time at 12 o'clock. The AAPRP, who we are, we're a Pan-African revolutionary organization. Our political objective is one unified socialist Africa, and we want to say, stay ready for the revolution. And once Africa is free, we'll all will be free. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.